So we finished the Imrei Yaakov yesterday, and what we were talking about was if someone places things on my property without asking me permission, then I'm not obligated to tiptoe around them. And this got the Imrei Yaakov, Reb Stern, to talk about a situation where if I have permission to put things down, then if someone were to walk past them and knock them over and break them, then under most situations, they would be liable for that because I had permission to put them there. If I put something, by contrast, in a Rishus Harabim and they break, the people in the Rishus Harabim are not liable. But if I put something in a place which is meant for putting things there, and then someone comes along and clumsily knocks them over and breaks them, so then the person is going to be liable. Machlokes, if I put them down there when it's dark and there's not proper lighting, that's an issue that the post can bring up, and if a person puts obstacles in a path that makes it impossible for people to walk through, then I'm even permitted to actively walk on those items, and I have no obligation to try to avoid them. Okay, so before we go further into the next halacha, let's take a look back into some of the biurim. We had said okay. Okay, so in this, we said that if someone puts something in my garage that was not meant for rental, I'm allowed to immediately throw them out into the street or to the shuk, and I don't even have to notify him in advance. I can just notify him, and I have to notify him after the fact. I'm not obligated to notify him before the fact, but I am obligated to notify him as soon as possible after I've removed the items from my space. I'm not allowed to hire workers from the commodity itself, because the person, unlike the previous halacha, the person did not make false promises to me. He just put his stuff there. So in the biurim, Rav Stern writes, "Umodio achar kach mashma dahoda zu midina shechayav lahodio v'lo rak midat chasidut elo chiyuv gamur." It seems like in this halacha, I'm obligated to notify the person who put stuff in my garage, not just because of a midas chasidus, not just because of an act of piety. Gam la'el sivches kasav delachar shishlichem l'shuk tzarech lahodia lebal haperas. And that's this in the previous halacha as well. Once, if a person has acted in bad faith, made certain assurances, and never made good on them, and that therefore gives me a right to toss his stuff out of my real estate, I still have to notify him as soon as possible after I've gotten rid of his stuff. Amnam hagam shaharav sasam kain b'pshitus. But the truth is, this is debated by the poskim whether I'm truly obligated to even notify the guy. He says there's a case that's brought in the Chavos Yoer where a person finds a package that was placed inside his property without his knowledge. There's no labeling on the package. No one knows who the package belongs to, but I find a package in my house or in my garage or on my property. V'natal hachavila v'zarka mibeso. And so I basically say, I don't know what this is. I go ahead and I toss. The Chavos Yair was faced with this following shaila. So the guy takes the package and just puts it out to the street. He doesn't know, it's not his. It's no idea who it belongs to, but it's got nothing to do with him. And then the owner of the package comes to his house a few days later and says, someone dropped off a package at your house. Can I have it, please? Okay. So the cost of Sham Dal Pi Hadin Chayiv L'Shalim Lo. And the Chavos Yair actually holds the homeowner liable in that situation, which is surprising, right? Now, the Herich Bazeh Neged Dayan Echad Dispir Le'Dudu Pater. There was another rabbi of his time that held that the homeowner was pater. Because of Alava Pischei Tshuva Diladina Devarav Nechonim Dehol V'lo Hodia LeBeistin Havi Mazik V'Yadayim U'Mechuyev L'Shalim. And the Pischei Tshuva says, I agree with the Chavos Yair. Since you didn't tell anybody that you were tossing a package out that doesn't belong to you, you didn't even notify the Beis Din, so then you're liable. Ulam la'niyas daiti ein davar zeh pashut klal. Udvar tzarach iyan kidul l'kaman. He says, but that's not so clear to me. It may not have been a very nice thing that you did to take a package, let's say a pile of laundry or whatever it is that doesn't belong to you and just toss it out. But can we go so far as to say that you have to pay the person? V'nira la'niyos daiti diachol balabais lomar kimli kahapotrim. The balabais, I believe, can say that this is a machlokas, and I paskin like those who say you're potter. The hagam de psak zeh shel harav v'chein shel hachavos yair mekor medivrei habach v'asma, etc. The svirlu de l'kulam yashchiyuv lahodio is, even though there is one side in the poskin who say that you must notify the owner, al kolpanim la'acher shahotzi hapiros l'shuk, at least immediately after you remove the items from your premises. Begam laha Rambam im lo hodiu chayiv ba'onsam, and according to the Rambam as well, if you don't notify the owner, then you're liable for anything that happens to the commodity. Aval be'emes deshitasim hu neged divrei Beis Yosef v'hadarkei Moshe. Deheim sovrim de laha Rambam yesh lifter b'chol gavni. But Rav Yosef Cairo, Moshe Isserlis, and their commentaries to the Torah hold that you are potter. Begam la'achar sheish lecha peres l'shuk in chayiv lo hodiu klal medina. And similarly, even after you toss the items, you're still not obligated according to them. And he's going to go through a whole rigmarole over here. So what does he get to at the bottom line? Okay. The last thing that he writes is as follows. He says, "V'da od dema dematzoi b'mikvos uvote merchatz sha'anashim mashim sham begadim sham v'kasha lahachzikam sham." I want to finish off, he says, with a practical issue. You can have a mikveh or you can have a bathhouse where people leave their towels or their clothes, personal effects, and they forget them there. They leave them there. The owner of the mikveh, it may be difficult for them to keep the items there for any extended period of time. Ubala mikveh rotze lahashlicham chutza. So the owner of the mikveh wants to put them outside in front of the mikveh and basically dispose of them. Bikoach hadin ispar le'el, based on what we've written before, that just because if you leave something on my property, I should have a right to toss it because you didn't have permission to leave it there. Now, what about the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda? So he says, Aval be'emes dezeh ein leilef mahalachazu. He says, no, that we're not going to be prepared to let you do. De'ein zedom alahacha dekan mayri shehuchnasu bekavana almanas sheyisharu bevesa. He says, it's one thing when a person intentionally puts something in your house without permission with the objective of using your home as a storage space. Raknasa shelo b'ritzon ba'olim, without asking you permission. Masha'ein kein b'mikvazu aveda gemura. But when someone leaves an umbrella in the shul or a raincoat or some towels in the mikveh, he says he forgot it. That's aveda. That's a lost item. Shehu sherusham mishichacha v'yesh b'hem mishum hashavas aveda. He says, "Umikol makom efshur diyachol balamikva litlos shelet shekol hamashir sham begadim yeda sheina lehem achrayis klal v'chulei v'tzarchiim." But it could be that permission is granted to a proprietor to basically say, not responsible for lost or forgotten items. And then you could, after a certain reasonable amount of time, pack things up and toss them. It could be, there are plenty of places like that where you need to keep the place immaculately clean for the next customer. So if a customer leaves an item, you should probably bag it and leave it for a certain amount of time, right? Whether it's 30 days, whether it's a week, or whatever it is. But Rav Stern feels that it's sufficient to place a sign and say not responsible for lost or forgotten items. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They deliver a package incorrectly, not one, but more common, I think, is you often get mail delivered to the mailbox from owners of from previous owners of your house, or at least I do.
Yes.
Is your responsibility there to try and track down the person to give him the mail, or to give him the package? Or?
It's an interesting question. In the States, where we used to live, if you put on occupant no longer lives in this home, the mailman picks it up and brings it back to the post office and returns to sender. It's a good song. Yeah, but anyway, but here in Canada, the mail carriers get annoyed when you do that. My wife does it all the time. And usually what happens is she leaves it there, a day or two goes by and the mail carrier just ignores it. And then eventually they realize that she's not giving up. And so they take it, which was a surprise. There's always differences, slight differences in the way things work. Yeah. Will they do that here also?
I think it would go back to if there's a return address.
Yeah.
But isn't there a responsibility of the previous person living there, because you can arrange to the post office to forward the mail?
Yeah. So right. So the only thing is that I know with the mail carriers in the States, and that's probably true here as well, they'll only do it for 6 months. What happens if a long lost relative were to send a letter or a gift into the mail without realizing that they had moved 5 years ago? Okay, and that does happen. Most of the mail that we get to our house that's for a previous owner is the kind of mail that we know that the previous owner would prefer not to get. Yeah, either junk mail or or you owe us money. Yeah. Right. So we generally toss the junk mail stuff. That's for sure you can throw away. The stuff that looks official or looks like it's a personal, you should try to track down if it's at all possible, and just have the address or the contact information you can probably get from your realtor who sold you the house. It shouldn't be a difficult task to do, and you should try. It would be a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda to do that if the item is of value to the owner. In other words, the owner or the person to whom it was addressed did not deliberately exploit you by having his mail sent to your address. It just was done because of a miscommunication. So there, I think there is a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda.
And similarly, if they delivered it to your neighbor instead of you or something like that. It's not a previous person.
Right. And it happens quite often. Amazon or the mail carrier will put something in my mailbox that really belongs to my neighbor. So how much of a burden? Yeah. So how much of a burden is it really to just drop something off to the guy next door or across the street. That happens all the time. And of course, we should be good neighbors. Halachically, probably have a mitzvah of Hashava Saveda, especially if it's another Jew. What if they deliver it to you? What if Amazon delivers something to you that belongs to someone who's on the other side of town, which is which would be very unusual. But I suppose in theory it could happen. Do you have an obligation to exert yourself to such an extent? Probably not. There you go. There you go. So I don't think that you have the obligation, but it's an easy thing to contact. I would assume it should be easy to contact the carrier, whether it's Amazon or Percolator or whatever it is. Purolator, Percolator, Purolator. I had zero coffee. So you should definitely get in touch with them and say, please pick up this package. It's in the front of my house. Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next halacha. Okay. Hoel shehu sechir yom. Sarach li'inyan linhog bi'inyan ha'hashkama v'ha'arava k'minek schire ha'ir. So now we get to a slightly different subject, which is a person who is an employee. This goes into employee law or labor law. He's paid by the day, which was typically how workers worked back then. They weren't paid by the hour, they were paid by the day. And if you're a day laborer, you get a certain flat fee for the day, then you have to come on time and you have to leave on time. Right? In the way that the standard is for all people who work for the day. Lefi, shekol haniskar bistam, niskar al derech haminhag. Because whenever you're hired for a job, the assumption is that the standards of the community or the municipality that you're living in are applied to the terms of that employment. Okay? V'chein hamalamed, and the same thing will be true when the teacher is hired. Uvamakom she'ein minhag yadua, in a situation where there is no standardized custom, yetze lefa'olo achar zrichas hashemesh, v'yavod ad seis hakochavim. Then the halachic requirement is for any person who's hired for the day to leave for work from his home after sunrise and to work until nightfall. That's the standard. Talk about rigorous work in the summer, So that would be tough, right? Shazehu din Torah, because that's the way the Torah describes what a day laborer is. Kemo shekasuv tizrach hashemesh yitzei adam lefa'alo v'la'avodaso adei arev. He says, because it says in Tehillim that when the sun shines, a person goes out to his work and continues working until evening, until the nighttime. Okay, so the first halacha that we're encountering with labor law are what the responsibility of an employee is, which is interesting. Labor law many times, just like we saw with tenancy laws, modern liberal law tends to favor the tenant over the landlord, whereas in halacha, we definitely see a difference in that emphasis. The same thing is true with employer-employee. The very first halacha we see is the responsibility or the duties of an employee to his employer and not the other way around, which, when you think about it logically, is the way it ought to be. There's such a sense of entitlement in today's society. What are you going to do for me as my boss when you give me my paycheck, and what are my benefits and my vacations, yada, 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 yada. None of that exists from a halachic standpoint. From a halachic standpoint, in a free enterprise financial system, the guy who's paying my wages is doing me is there is a business agreement between us, and I have to know what my duties are in order to earn my paycheck. I have responsibilities, and sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle of today's society. But that's the very first halacha. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. You have to pay. You have to work keminhag schirei ha'ir, according to the custom of employees. V'hu hadin le'inyan hachbadas ol haschirus. The same thing is true about the rights of the employee vis-a-vis the employer. In other words, how hard is the employer allowed to work the employee? That's what hachbadas ol haschirus. To what extent is the employer allowed to work the employee? It's a reciprocal. Just as an employee has certain duties towards his employer, an employer has certain duties to not overwork his employee. And he writes, "Im yadua eich noagim harov aslinan basrayu." If there's a certain standard that you have to give a certain number of breaks per day to a laborer, so then an employer has that obligation. My son makes his living litigating these kinds of cases. He's a class action lawyer who specializes in labor law, and he regularly litigates against corporations for not paying overtime and for not giving proper breaks. Or let's say the company has a certain kind of uniform or outfit that you have to put on when you're in the factory in the production line. So the amount of time that it takes to get undressed and to put on the garment, are you on the company's clock time, or is that on your time? And so that's like, he deals with those things all the time. V'imi efshar levarer lo matzi balabayis lahatil ol she'eno noheg bebirur. And in any situation where there's ambiguity in the law, the employer does not have a carte blanche to just work the employee to, excessively. Whenever there's a place where the employee says this is not normal, that has to be taken to a din Torah. The employer doesn't have a right to overwork the employee just at a whim.
How far ahead of its time this is. In those days, the employer just did whatever they wanted to.
That's right.
It's only in the last, 50 years or so, there's such a thing as
right.
these kind of laws.
Correct. Okay. So you go according to the conventions or the standards of the place. When a person is employed without any explicit stipulations, aniskar bistam, when you're retained without any stipulations, v'imsachar pol stam ibli liktzotzimo, v'chenim asam malacha shelo b'kitzitza. He says, if let's say an employer and employee enter into an agreement that let's say you're going to come work for me. So the halacha is, now what happens if there was no wage that was set for that work, for that day laborer? There was no wage set, but I just started working for you, and how much do you have to pay me? So the halacha is, says the Imrei Yaakov, ein lo ella kepachos shebepoalim. He says the employer cannot, since the employee is trying to extract payment, he's at a disadvantage because he's already worked, and now he says, this is what you owe me. Well, prove that's what I owe you. So the employer has the advantage of basically saying there is a minimum, like a minimum wage, that I know I have to pay you, but I don't have to pay you more than minimum wage. Okay, vafilu imrubam niskarim bedalad umiyuta begimel ein holchim b'mamon achar harov. And even if in this kind of line of work, some are paid, let's say, 4 zuz an hour. Most are paid 4 zuz an hour. And there's a minority that are paid 3 zuz an hour or 3 zuz for the day. The employer could say, I'm part of the minority. I pay less for this kind of work. The no saying lo rak gimel. You can pay him 3. The davka kishasochar bisnam v'lo hisker klal lomar lefi damim shesochrim ba'ir. But that's only if you hired him without any stipulation. But let's say the stipulation is, I'll pay you whatever the going rate for this work is. So then, lachein ein lo ela kepacho shebepolim, he says, then, he says, then, because there was no stipulation, the employee is not entitled to get more than the lowest paid laborer. The dasa adam who kishar hazal, because when no stipulation was made, an employee assumes he's going to get the lowest wage. Avalim omer lo she'itin lo ke'echad uchishnai mibnei ha'ir denachis l'shuma. He says, but if he says to him, "I'll pay you based upon the going rate," and we will find out what the going market value is for this kind of work. Then the employer has obligated himself to pay the average going rate for this kind of labor. I think he doesn't mean the average, but he really means the median, because basically the way he's saying it is, you find out what the highest wage is in the city for this kind of work, you take the lowest amount that people are getting for the same kind of work, and you take the midpoint between the two of them. Is that what we call a median? Yeah, so that's what he means. Let's say you have some who get 3 zuz a day, some get 5 zuz, some get 6 zuz. You give him the median between 3 and 6, which would be 4.5. Right? And let's say you hire someone and the guy wishes to back out of the deal. That's something that we discussed all the way back in Siman Aleph, Sifkat and Yudalid. So we could, if you want, just take a quick look at that. Let's see here. It would be in Imrei Yaakov, volume 1. So there we go. Yeah. Imheim sachru malamed v'rotzim lachzor bahem. Afterm shehischol b'malacha enam yicholam lachzor. Afshalo nasa shum kinyan. The Maisa Hakol in Sarach Kinyan. He says, if the city council hires an employee, even before he starts working, they can't go back on the deal. Aval bistam shlosha anashim shesachru malamed b'shutfus v'lo asu kinyan, yicholam lachzor bahem min adin. He says, but if you have a corporation that hires someone and they haven't signed a contract yet, and all they've done is give a verbal agreement, then either party can back out, even though there is what we call mechusar amana. There's a lack of, you're acting in bad faith. Just see. He says, v'chein balabayas yechidi. if you have a certain, oh, we're going to have to hold it here. But remind me, we'll go back to this in Mitzvah Shem next week. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.